Today's lecture is Chapter 8, and it's on memory. Researchers have studied memory from many different perspectives, and research on memory extremes have been really helpful for us to understand how memory works. So what I mean by that is studying people with excellent, superb memories and studying people, obviously, that have disruptions in their memories is what has helped scientists understand how memory works. These are some of the things we're going to cover in this chapter today. Okay. Memory as defined in our book is the persistence of learning over time through the encoding, storage, and retrieval of information. These pieces are really important. And so it's info that has been acquired, right, encoded, it's information that's been stored, and it's information that can be retrieved. And when you study memory, you're studying disruptions in memory, you could potentially be studying disruptions in any three of those stages. So disruptions or problems with acquiring or encoding memories, disruptions or problems with the storage of memories, and then finally you could be studying difficulties with retrieving information memories. There's three measures of memories that researchers use. And that's recall, recognition, and relearning. These are three measures that prove evidence that learning has occurred or existed. And there are three measurements that have been used to study retention of memory. And psychologists can measure these forms of memory separately. So measures of recall involve retrieving information that is not currently in your conscious awareness, but was learned at an earlier time. Recognition is defined as identifying items previously learned. And relearning is defined as learning something more quickly when you encounter it a second time around. Overall, I want you to remember that recognition memory is probably the quickest and it's the most vast. So it's the most amount of memory that we maintain in our storage, in our brain storage, is that of recognition memory. I wanted to talk a little bit about Ebbinghaus's retention curve. Generally, what the Ebbinghaus was a memory researcher. Generally, he proposed that our response speed when we're recalling or recognizing information indicates the memory strength. So if our speed of relearning is quicker, if our recognizing memories is quicker, that means that those particular memories were of stronger strength or significance to begin with. Much of his research was done over the 19th century, so we've known a lot about the retention curve for quite a while. And what he found is that the more times he practiced a list of nonsense syllables on day one, the less time he required to relearn it on day two. So he showed relearning effects where it took him a shorter period of time to relearn the material after he was exposed to the material previously at a higher rate. So again, speed of relearning is one measure of memory retention. If we're retaining memories, it's going to be easier and speedier to relearn that information again. This is actually important for students because it really helps to reinforce the principle of rehearsing material. So if you're studying for exam, if you want to remember something, rehearse that piece of material over and over in your mind. Maybe reread it, say it out loud a few times. That kind of repetition helps to speed up memory. Also important about studying memory is psychologists have used different memory models to think about and communicate about memory. So memory models help us to think about how our brain forms and retrieves memories. There's these two models that have been predominantly popular in literature. One is the information processing model, and the other one is a connectionism information processing model. So the information processing model really compares human memory to computer operations. So it really kind of equates the storage of memories the same way a computer stores memory, or a computer stores information rather. And the way that a computer stores information, we have to think about three processes. It encodes it, inquires it, someone has to enter it into the computer. We have to store it in a particular spot on the computer, and then we have to, at some point, go in and retrieve it. And so folks that study human memory, that kind of equate the process around human memory in this three-stage process, are those that believe in the information processing model. Now, a connectionism information processing model, this really focuses on processing things simultaneously, processing and focusing on information on a multi-track or a parallel processing model, things that we're learning explicitly or consciously, and also things that we might be acquiring more on a subconscious or unconscious level. So it views memories really as products of interconnected neural networks. And most human brains, researchers believe most human brains really operate on a connectionism information processing model, where specific memories really arise from specific activation patterns, right? So there's when we encode a memory, we're not only recognizing things that we're visibly seeing and storing, but we also might be remembering unconscious items like maybe smells or other noises or sights that we might not be consciously aware of. Yet when we retrieve that memory, we realize that there was other pieces about the event that we remember. Memory models are important when we think about research and the field of memory. Atkinson and Schifrin put forth a fairly comprehensive model on memory that involves three processing stages: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So sensory memory, we record to be remembered information as a fleeing sensory memory. So that is probably the lowest level of memory that we can process and consolidate in our brains is a sensory memory, a very short, very fleeting memory. We also process information into short-term memory, where we might purposely encode information through rehearsal. So if we want to remember something in the short term, right, maybe for 5-10 minutes, if we want to try to remember something in short-term memory, you'll see later on, years later, short-term memory got recoined, rephrased into working memory. But we often do process this type of short-term memory throughout the day. We hold things in short-term memory throughout the day, and sometimes we can improve our short-term memory when we rehearse things. The best example I can think of here is maybe you're trying to remember a phone number, and you might repeat that phone number over and over again to keep it or store it in short-term memory. Long-term memory is probably really the most evidence of a consolidated and stored memory, and that's actually when we move information from our short-term memory into long-term memory. And obviously, when something's stored in long-term memory, it can be retrieved at any time later on. A visual representation of these three-stage model from Atkinson and Schifrin. So we have an external event, right? Some type of sensory input happens. We see something, hear something, process something. We have a quick sensory memory where we have an activation of those sensory receptors. And now, as humans, we have to intentionally decide, do we want to pay attention to this important and novel information? If we do, we may pay attention to it a bit, focus on it. We may do some encoding tactics like rehearsal, like do something to keep it active in maintenance, right? And keep it active in short-term memory. And then we have to decide to be purposeful about moving that information to long-term memory. There are a few things that we see slide by this process. There are some exceptions to the rule, actually. Sometimes very traumatic incidences, sometimes very meaningful or vivid experiences can move directly from sensory memory into long-term memory storage. But most often, if we want to remember something, we have to actively engage in this middle process. We have to actively engage our working or short-term memory to get that information into long-term. So here's some updated concepts I mentioned. Years later, Atkinson and Schifrin moved away from using the term short-term memory and moved it to working memory. And really the purpose of that was to stress really the active process that occurs within this second memory stage, the different rehearsal strategies that we use to try to hold on to information and push it to long-term memory storage. The other thing I mentioned to you was also the model had to be accommodated for this automatic processing, because there was information that kind of just slid in, information that was outside of our conscious awareness that we know that kind of slides right into long-term memory. And this can be a fairly common thing in human brains. So let's talk a little bit about the concept of working memory. So working memory involves new understanding of short-term memory. As I mentioned to you, it was a newer understanding that Atkinson and Schifrin introduced. And it focuses on a very conscious and active processing of incoming auditory or visual spatial information. And it focuses on an active process of information that we then can also retrieve from long-term memory. It's almost like a scratch pad, right? Where our brain makes sense of new experiences and links them with our long-term memories purposely, right? It's a system for holding on to things in our mind while we're working on them. Dual track memory is an important concept to think about when we're thinking about memory and we're discussing memory. Both types of tracks here, both types of processing paths lead to a way in which we can form and create memories. I want to define some things here. When we do something very effortfully, when we're purposely concentrating on something, that's a little bit different than automatic processing, right? And I've mentioned that a few times. And so since there's a difference, there's two ways to sort of think about memory processing. The first is explicit memories. These are like declarative memories. I think about these as facts and knowledge, right? These are conscious facts and experiences that we encode through conscious and effortful processing. So right now you're engaging in explicit memories. Hopefully you're creating some explicit memories. You're listening to facts, you're consciously paying attention, you're consciously aware of the experiences that you're having throughout this lecture, and you're purposely trying to encode this information into your memory for retrieval at some point later on. Implicit memory is a little bit of an opposite. It's a non-declarative memory, which means that these are memories that are often formed through automatic processes, and they kind of bypass this conscious encoding track. Best way to think about this is if someone's singing you happy birthday, I'm sure you can pretty much remember who sang you happy birthday last year, what your cake looked like, who was there singing, and how you felt at that particular time. I'm sure you weren't sitting there saying to yourself, I have to purposely remember this. Let me look around and make sure I know who's here. Let me purposely remember what kind of cake this is. Let me purposely remember where I'm sitting right now. There's certain experiences that we have in life where our memory storage is really more automatic. Okay? So encoding memories, some interesting information when we encode or when we store, right? When we acquire a memory, when we're actively trying to gather sensory information to bring that into our minds. Again, we have a more automatic process here to talk about, and we have an effortful process. So an automatic process, implicit memories, these non-declarative memories that we talked about, that singing birthday song to you, they include often automatic skills, and they're often associated with things that we've learned in previous years, right, earlier years, through classical conditioning associations. So automatic processing, we automatically store information about space, time, and frequency. We don't necessarily have to purposely remember to do that, right? So back to our happy birthday example. We didn't purposely have to store, where am I? What time is it? What is the frequency in which people are singing me this information? There's certain experiences that we have where those experiences automatically form implicit memories through their associations, their happy events, their sad events, they're usually emotionally charged events, and those are automatically saved. We don't have to do much to remember those things. Effortful processing, on the other hand, there's a lot of explicit memories where we have to specifically experience something over and over again. We have to practice it. And it only is once we practice it does it become automatic, right? So the information that you're learning today isn't going to automatically slide into your brain for purposeful storage into a long-term memory, right? You're going to have to do something with this information. You're going to have to retrieve it up again. You might have to reread it. You might have to look at it again. And the more that you look at it, the more that you're effortful about it, the more then automatic that particular memory of information will become. So next slide, things to think about. Just think about the left-hand slide. We're not really going to look at the eye chart on the right-hand side, but the left-hand side. There's been a concept that's sensory memory, right? Sensory memory, right? We're talking about these fleeing sensations, these very brief snippets of things that we see here, and how do we think about this information in terms of memory. So fleeting memories for images or sounds that are just heard, in order to make a fleeting memory a memory, we have to do something with it, right? So sensory memory that is fleeting, people that view sensory messages or sensory information for only 1/20th of a second, they could recall only about half of that information later on, right? So sensory memory, and what we mean by fleeing is sensory memory goes quick, right? So you're not going to remember a lot of it unless you do something with it. So sensory memory is the first stage in forming explicit memories. It's very immediate. It's very brief recording of sensory information in the memory system. It could be just a picture image memory, or it could be a sound memory. Again, it's going to flee. You're going to forget it if you don't do something with it and move it on to a latter memory stage, either working memory or long-term memory. So let's talk about short-term memory capacity. Short-term memory is activated memory that holds a few items briefly before the information is stored or forgotten. So a phone number is really kind of good to remember as an example, because usually it's 7 digits that can be held in short-term memory, you know, give or take 1 or 2. George Miller was the researcher that has done a number of experiments in the mid-1950s and discovered that the magic number was 7, that most people can actually store 7 bits of information in short-term memory. And unless they purposely do some activity to move that information to long-term memory, they're not going to remember facts beyond 7 digits unless something is purposely done with it. Later colleagues came along in the mid-1970s, and they pretty much reinforced what George Miller discovered. Without distraction, most people can remember 7 digits, 6 letters or 5 words. So again, 7, plus or minus a few, depending upon what you're speaking of, letters, numbers, words, what are we talking about? So again, working memory here can really vary depending upon age and other factors, right? So if you're tired, if you're hungry, if you're half paying attention, those things might actually impair some of your short-term memory, making it even harder to remember 7 bits of information in short-term memory. If you're focused, if you're well rested, if you're into the subject that's being talked about or read about, if you're minimizing your distractions, those are going to be that's going to be situations that's going to actually help or aid your short-term memory capacity. Young adults tend to have greater working memory capacity. That shouldn't really surprise anybody. The ability to juggle multiple items while processing information is better in young adults than it is older adults. As we begin to get older, our working memory does not actually work that well any longer. The only thing that I want to say about another thing rather that I want to say about short-term memory is short-term memory, if you haven't gotten the hint yet, it decays very quickly unless you engage, again, in sometimes a strategy to move that memory into some longer term storage, right? Some rehearsal, some looking at the information over and over again. So you can kind of see the percentage of individuals that recalled a list of letters decrease significantly over time when no rehearsal was allowed. Right? So when we allow rehearsal, that information stays more stable over time in our memories. I know that some of you believe in juggling multiple tasks at a time. Although that might help for short-term memory, juggling multiple things and multitasking works against long-term memory storage, right? So if you really want to remember something, you want to work on one thing at a time, you want to be very active, you want to be very active with that memory, that information rather in working memory. And you want to make sure that you try not to juggle too much. I remember just a personal story. Once I started to have some children, I got really nervous because I was like, God, I can't really remember anything anymore. What is happening? Do I have like early dementia? And really what I started to realize is the amount of time that I was spending throughout the day multitasking was impacting my ability to move experiences and events that I had throughout the day to longer term memory storage, right? So, you're trying to do multiple things at once. Again, that's not really helpful for moving things to long-term memory storage. So I've been talking about strategies, things that you could do to help yourself remember things, right? So here's some very effortful processing strategies that you can engage in that may help you to remember new information. So chunking, organizing of items into familiar, manageable units. This can often happen sometimes automatically. Sometimes when we hear new information, we look for similarities, we look at ways in which things can be grouped together, and we automatically can engage in some of some of these chunking strategies. Also, if something is personally meaningful, it works even better, right? So organizing something into a familiar, oh, I think I've seen this before. Oh, that's pretty similar to this. When I meet somebody who has the first name Ken, I always say, oh, I'm going to remember that name pretty quickly because that's my brother's name. So the ways in which you can kind of make information familiar to you or link them together, group them together, can increase your capacity to remember them. Mnemonics, these can be memory aids, especially techniques that use vivid imagery and, ways in which you can use organizational devices can help memory improve. I always remember this, in grammar school, we remembered, the lakes in the United States by using an acronym, or you can remember things in mathematics, like, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, you do how you do plus, subtraction, parentheses, right? Your pattern in which you solve mathematical equations, you can help remember that sequence with a mnemonic. Hierarchies, right? So creating organizing your items into a few broader categories that are divided and subdivided can help, right? So breaking things up, dividing them into narrow concepts or facts, right? So that's when we group things again together, it can help increase our recall 2 to 3 times better. So you have a long list of items. Maybe you can group them into categories that might help you remember when you maybe go to a store to pick them up, or when you're trying to recall something for a test. Grouping lists of items into smaller subgroups can help increase memory retention. Distributed practice is a real big one. Really helps this type of rehearsal of information, helps move information from short-term memory into longer-term memory more effectively. Spaced studying is a really neat concept for students, right? So when we put some time and space in between our studying sessions, our encoding is more effective when it's spread out over time. So, sometimes people think, oh, I'm going to cram all night. I'm going to put a pull an all-nighter. Well, pulling an all-nighter or cramming a lot of information into a uninterrupted period of time definitely produces speedy short-term learning, and it can increase your confidence, but it actually is very poor and has very poor outcomes for long-term recall. So if you want to remember something again, do distributed practice, right? Look over the material, take a break, visit it again, visit it a few days later, take a break, visit it a few days later, right? So the way in which you're able to do that helps really, solidify memory. So there's a little example here that if you review something even one day later, it actually will help you to remember things for 10 days. So again, if you want to remember something over the long haul, visit it more frequently. One way to do and engage in distributed practice is to do testing, is to do test yourself, right? So there's a testing effect. When we do retrieval practice tests, it enhances our performance. So testing ourselves improves learning and memory, and testing also protects our memory from the harmful effects of stress. And actually, it's better to actually practice retrieval than to simply just keep rereading the material. So those of you that actually do flashcards by putting some of the information on the front of the card, maybe like the word, and then putting the definition on the back of the card, and trying to test yourself by reading one side of the card and trying to remember the other is actually even a more effective testing strategy. That's retrieval than just rereading information over and over again. So get active with the information that you want to remember. I'm going to talk a little bit about levels of processing. This really reminds me a lot about, kind of conscious processing and unconscious processing. I guess there's different ways to term these types of processes. We understand material, we take in material, obviously at different levels. That's not the first time that I've pointed to that throughout this course. And so the depth of how we process information affects our long-term retention. That shouldn't be a surprise, right? Something that you look at very briefly, something that you look at a very basic level, your long-term memory retention for shallow processing information is not going to be as strong as your long-term memory for information that you process on a deeper level, right? So deep processing, that's when we encode, right? We acquire information that is semantically based on word meaning, right? So we understand the meaning of the information. We make associations to the information. We read between the lines, right? We understand what the information is trying to convey. Engaging in those types of deep processing of information is going to enhance our long-term memory retention. We're going to skip down a little bit to our brain. Voila, you've seen this picture before. So right here by the amygdala on the outside would be our ear. So we're looking at the brain from a side view. You should recognize that. Frontal lobes are here on the left. So we're looking at the brain from the side view. Okay, so what's some key structures here in memory? The ones that you see highlighted, right? So we talk about the limbic system, right? The limbic system was made up of the amygdala, the hippocampus, the basal ganglia. You also remember that the limbic system is probably one of the most strongly correlated parts of the brain in terms of, connecting memory to emotions. So we see a lot of really interesting literature out there that shows, the stronger emotional response we have to an event, the easier it is to recall or remember that event. That is due to your limbic system. The limbic system brings that emotionality to the memory, right? Hippocampus was primarily that's the part of the brain that's primarily responsible for memory storage. So all the more convenient that it's located right next to the amygdala, which helps our brain process emotion. All right, so we're going to skip to a little bit of a review. I'm trying to keep it short so that you don't lose interest in the video today. But here's our two memory systems. So again, just to review, memory processing happens according to two systems, right? This automatic system and this more effortful system. So on your left, automatic, these are primarily memories that are implicit in nature. They are stored through an automatic process. They are often stored through a process that involves, a lower level of processing, maybe shallow processing. They're usually non-declarative memories. They're not factually based in most instances. We can also often recall them really without much conscious recall. They're mainly processed in the brain through the cerebellum and basal ganglia. And some things automatically happen. So we automatically remember things like space, time, and frequency. We can automatically remember where we ate yesterday, what time we ate dinner. Those are things are pretty easy to recall. It's not like we purposely sit down at the table and purposely study the clock at which time we're eating. There's just certain things that happen in our life. They kind of slide right into long-term memory storage in a very automatic way, automatic processing. Riding a bike is another really good example of an automatic memory. Anything, also classical conditioning, something that's highly emotionally charged, something that might have been very fretful. Those are things that are easily stored into memory. On the right hand of the side are the things that we have to work on, right? The things we really have to work for. School-based memory, right? Declarative memory, memory about facts. These are things that we have to purposely engage in conscious processes, deep processing, right? And we have to often do some conscious recall of this to get this information back up into mind. The hippocampus and frontal lobes are excited and used when we're trying to use our effortful memory processes. We have two different types of memories that can be stored under effortful processing: semantic memories and episodic memories. Okay, let's talk a little bit about retrieval cues, right? So assuming that something has gotten into your long-term memory, you've done some good working memory tactics to get that sensory memory into your long-term memory. Let's say it got there, it got stored. Well, now you want to bring it up. You want to purposely recall something, right? Let's talk about different memory retrieval cues that we can use. So memories are held in our brain storage, right? They're held in storage, but they're held through a web of associations. And so each piece of a memory is interconnected with others. And what I mean by that, memories are not stored like books on a bookshelf. They're not independently stored. They're not placed in one spot where they can be pulled down and replaced in the same exact spot. Memories often are in pieces of a memory, are stored in different parts of the brain, and they're interconnected with each other to create that full memory of an event. So if we engage in some type of retrieval cues follow the same principle. If we can activate one spot of these interconnected pieces, then that can serve as a retrieval cue for the entire memory. Okay, so for example, when you can't find your keys, you might say, let me go to the place where I last had them, because something in that place where you were might retrieve or might cue off one of the retrieval cues, one of the retrieval clues that might then activate that interconnected pattern of the entire memory. Okay, so things like priming, context-dependent memory, state-dependent memory, serial positioning, we're going to study all these things because they're important and they influence the way that we remember things. So I reviewed this a little bit already. Memories are held through a web of associations, and retrieval cues can kind of be these anchor points, right? Different points along the pathway that can help retrieve that full memory. We're going to skip priming. Actually, let's not skip priming. So priming, again, how we activate different associations can help us increase our awareness and memory of a concept, right? So priming is the activation of particular associations in our memory. So here is a little bit of an interesting experiment that people have tried. So in other words, in the experiment, they exposed participants to either seeing or hearing the word rabbit. And they might have said it or showed it to the person over and over again, right? So they might have said, rabbit, 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 please repeat after me, and the participant would repeat the word. Or they might have shown a picture of the rabbit over and over and over again, right? And then we then say, please, spell the word here. Now, if you haven't seen a rabbit, you would most likely spell the word here, H-A-I-R, because that's the most common concept that we think about when we hear the word here. But participants that were, again, predisposed, they were primed to think about a rabbit by seeing a rabbit or hearing the word rabbit, more often than not spelled hair as H-A-R-E, right? And so again, associations kind of unconsciously can activate and can influence our retrieval of certain types of memories. What are some memory retrieval cues? So let's talk about context-dependent memory. A little bit similar to what I gave you in terms of I forgot where my car keys are example. So context-dependent memory is when you can recall specific information, and when your recall of that specific information is improved when the context present at encoding is the same as the context at retrieval. Okay, so again, if I can't remember something, let me go to the last place where I learned or was exposed to that material, and that context might help me to recall. Okay, so retrieval becomes improved when you are in the same context or surroundings that you were in when you learned the material. Also, just different cues might be helpful to a specific memory when you're trying to recall that memory, right? So encoding specificity principle, a very generic definition, but again, go to something that's specific to that specific memory, right? Go to something, go to a place, retrieve a cue, think about something that was very specific to the information that you want to recall, and that should help you to recall that particular information. State-dependent memory, right? Go put yourself in the mood that you were in when you were first exposed to the event or the information you want to retrieve, right? So the tendency to recall events are better when you're trying to recall that information in a consistent atmosphere with your current mood, right? So if you're in a current good or bad mood and you're trying to recall something, go back to the memory that you were, you encoded that memory in the same good or bad mood. Mood congruent is pretty similar, a little bit different. State-dependent memory kind of is when you're recalling specific events. The way that I think about mood congruent memory is really, I think, more related to experiences. And you have a tendency to recall certain types of experiences based upon the mood that you're currently in, right? So say I wake up, I'm in a really bad, cranky mood. The instances in which it becomes easier now to recall memories from the last couple of days that were bad or unpleasant increases because I'm in a bad mood, right? When I'm in a good mood, when I'm feeling good, it becomes much easier to remember prior experiences that also are good in nature and have a good feeling associated with them. Okay, serial position effect, right? The tendency to recall best the last or the first items in a list. So let's say this experiment has been proven over and over again. I give you a long list of 20 items. You're going to recall best the first 3 items and the last 3 items, okay? That's the recency effect and the primacy effect. I used to see this all the time when I used to play the alphabet game with my kids, right? I'm going to the grocery store and I'm going to buy something that begins with the letter A. Okay, I'm going to buy apples. And then the next person uses the letter B. I'm going to buy bananas. But you have to repeat the previous words. So by the time you get to the end of the alphabet, you can kind of see that the words in the beginning of the grocery list are recalled better. The words at the end obviously are recalled better because we had just heard them. They might still be in our working memory. And the words at the beginning of the list are recalled better because those are the ones that we have some encoding, right? Some repetition. We've engaged in some strategies to put them into our memory. The words in the middle, well, those are the hardest ones to remember. All right, so well then why do we forget? Well, there's a lot of opportunity because forgetting can occur at any memory stage, right? So when we process information, we filter, we alter, or we lose much of the information. And we can filter it, alter it, or lose it amongst any point here on the journey of the information, right? So information bits are coming in all the time into sensory memory, depending upon, do we register this information? Do we notice it? How much detail do we give to it? Do we move it to working or short-term memory, right? Or do we notice it? Do we begin to encode it? Do we try to make sense of it? Then once we do that, do we purposely then alter the item? Do we assign meaning to it? How do we move it to our long-term storage, right? And then once it's in long-term storage, how do we retrieve it? Are we using an effective retrieval strategy? So you can kind of see anywhere along this information processing chain here, information can get lost. And if we're not actively doing stuff with information, then the likelihood of it being recalled decreases significantly. We're going to go a little bit to memory construction errors. Sorry, let me see if I can remember it here. I find it rather. Okay, so, psychologists have done, Elizabeth Loftus, Loftus, is probably the largest researcher in this area. Psychologists have been very intrigued and have documented over a long time how memories, when we are recalling them, can actually be reconstructed. And we can reweave things, we can change things often when we're recalling. And sometimes this is done purposefully, and sometimes it actually can be done, it often happens unconsciously, right? So think about maybe when you were little and you played the telephone game and you had a long list of people in a straight line, and one person started a sentence and it gets passed, whispered from one person to the next, all the way down the line. And you probably remember in a few instances, it was quite comical what the sentence sounded like at the end of the line. Probably sounded like nothing like it was, in its original form, right? This is a whole concept of memory construction and the errors that happen in memory construction. So researchers like Elizabeth Loftus have even shown in eyewitness testimonies where people are trying to reconstruct a memory, like after a crime or after a car accident, they often misremember information when they're exposed to misleading information between the time that the event happened and the time that it's been trying to be recalled, right? And there's two ways in which misinformation happens: the misinformation effect as well as the imagination effect. So after an accident happens, after an event happens, sometimes when we replay that information in our mind, when we purposely try to recall that information, it's prone to error. So a misinformation effect, a memory can be corrupted by misleading information. And Elizabeth Loftus kind of displayed that scenario time and time again through her experiments, right? And she would show witnesses, and it's described in the book for anybody that wants to look at this in more detail. But she would bring participants into the laboratory and she would have them view on the TV monitor. She'd have them watch a video of an accident, a car accident, where maybe one car was stopped at a stop sign. The car to the right of them was stopped at a stop sign, and they both leave the stop signs at the same time and they collide. And they usually then give, maybe half of the participants, they don't say anything to them after the event. They have them do a fairly unrelated exercise in between. And then they come back together and they say, okay, tell us what you saw in the video. And the person accurately describes, well, they were both stopped at a stop sign and they seemed to take off at the same time and they crashed. With a different group of folks, she would change the information that people were exposed to between the time of seeing the accident and having to recall the event. And what she would do is she would give them pieces of information. Maybe she would show them another video or give them pieces of information like, gee, that car at the stop sign, it didn't appear that they stopped all the way. Do you think that they stopped all the way? It appeared that they didn't even stop at all. They were going too fast. So she would feed them inaccurate information. And what do you think happened when they recalled those events? Those memories of the event contained the misleading information. Okay. The other thing is, repeatedly imagination effect. This has been shown in some concern sometimes in therapy cases where people talk about an event that may or may not have been real, but it's talked about so much that the person creates a memory around it. Right? So imagination effect is repeatedly imagining fake actions and events that can create false memories. And it may not be done purposefully, right? Sometimes we play over events in our mind. Maybe they might be influenced by our desires, our wishes. And as we replay that story over and over again, it slightly changes, it slightly shifts. And it might slightly shift so much over time and again and again and again that we tell the story that it turns into the telephone game, right? That by the time we tell the 20th story, the details of the story have converged, have moved away from the original event, right? So imagination effect. We know that this information happens for humans. And so we have to be really careful sometime around memory constructions and around memory retrieval, because we have to remember that sometimes as humans, our memories are prone to error. Some other common areas where memories might be prone to some error rather, is source amnesia. Like we might have the right memory, but sometimes we mess up how, when, or where that information was learned or imagined, right? So the source of where we learn that information was, misattributed. It's incorrectly connected with the memory, right? So source amnesia. We remember the memory correct, but we attribute it to the wrong kind of how, when, where, okay? Deja vu, right? An experience that we have all the time. Deja vu can actually be a highly inaccurate memory construction. So this sense of, haven't I experienced this before, right? So cues that we get from a current situation may unconsciously trigger retrieval of an earlier experience. And so those memories might be connected or not. That memory might be might not be accurate or not, but for some reason it gets associated with what you're doing in the moment. So, not that it's a bad thing, but I always tell people beware of those deja vu experiences, notice them, but also then do some own personal fact checking around it because they're a high source of of um, misattribution. I'm also going to post actually online in Husky CT. I'm going to post a YouTube video as well too. It's Elizabeth Loftus talking about some of this work on memory construction errors. And then also there's a good Netflix show. I know Netflix is not everybody's cup of tea, but there's a good Netflix show called Buried, Buried, and it's a relevant show that's related to the topic of memory. So if you have some free time and you're really interested in the topic of memory, you might want to check out that show as well too. Okay, so I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you tonight. I hope that you enjoyed the lecture. I hope you listened to it because it can help. Again, we're talking about memory, right? You want to memorize things for the exam. You want to remember things. Hopefully listening to this and looking at the slides increases your familiarity with the concepts and makes them easier to retrieve and recall when it comes test time. Okay, enjoy, and I will see you on March 27th. Bye-bye.